What do architecture and fashion have in common? Unfortunately, a lot. Pretty much everything. See, I am no great fan of fashion. Men and women are rarely on the same page about this issue.
Many women imagine that since they enjoy what they call shopping, which is of course browsing, trying on and purchasing clothes, there is no reason why you shouldn't find it enjoyable as well.
After all, we're the same species, aren't we? So there's no reason you should get upset when I tell you that I'm going shopping and ask you to come with. It's psychological torture. That said, when I see an image, I can certainly place a fashion in at least the right century, sometimes in the right decade and on the right continent. Many men are strangely knowledgeable like that. We can't remember what color dress you wore to whatever event a year ago, but we absolutely can distinguish between a tunic and a bustle. So how is this related to architecture? Well, first of all, fashion is an urban thing. New fashions never originate in the countryside. They originate in cities. Well, mostly in Milan, of course. But there's also London, Paris, and New York. Second of all, urban architecture sets the general mood, and fashion follows. The background matters a lot more than people like to admit. An evening gown looks out of place with something like that in the background. Now bear with me. Picture this young woman, let's call her, I don't know, Jill. She is nondescript, reticent, timid. Her colleagues barely notice her. She dresses modestly, for lack of a better word. She is what you'd call mousy, unremarkable, uninteresting, almost invisible. Then one day, the entire department is invited to the Renaissance Fair, and costumes are required. Most of the workers show up and witness the transformation. The mouse is now a dazzling star, and 5 minutes into the affair, she knows it. She is smiling luminously. Everybody's paying attention. Folks strike up conversations with her, and she answers readily, boldly, and she laughs easily. She's full of joy. She shines. She speaks confidently. Wait a minute, that's Jill? Really? Our Jill?
What women wear at the Renaissance Fair is not fashion history.
It's a selective revival of silhouettes that flatter the human body and express confidence. We're not talking about correct 16th century understructures, period accurate proportions, historically faithful materials, or tailoring logic. They're wearing corset-inspired bodices, often Victorian, not Renaissance, exaggerated waists, lifted bust lines, controlled volume, rich textures and colors. This is not ignorance. It's curation. The two revolutions, American and French, changed the general approach to fashion forever. Men's fashion transformation was no less dramatic than women's, with one important distinction. Once transformed from, stockings, breeches, and overcoats to jackets, trousers, and leather shoes, the fashion just froze in time. Nothing has changed in principle for, 2 centuries now. Pants widened and narrowed, tails disappeared, the top hat was replaced by the
derby,
then by the cap, and then by nothing. Neckties emerged, vanished, and re-emerged, but the overall look has remained largely the same. The cultural responsibility for visible beauty was offloaded onto women.
No fair.
And has been with women ever since. Now, prior to those two revolutions, aristocratic women, the elite, wore panniers, 2 baskets of whalebone or cane.
This corresponded with a period of architecture known as Rococo.
Late Baroque, with excessive ornament, often dismissed as garish by modern taste, even though I personally do have a soft spot for it. Garish or good taste? I'm still a bit torn on that. Immediately following the French Revolution, women's fashions went through two periods that imitated to some extent Greek and Roman antiquity, the Directoire and the Empire style. In other words, Robespierre and Napoleon. The corresponding change in architecture was
The shift from Rococo to Classicism, minimal yet elegant.
this was followed by the brief romantic interruption. The waist dropped, the fabrics became thicker, less austere. Neoclassical buildings began to appear all over the world, and these were residential buildings, not just like churches and palaces. And then the hoop skirt made a comeback. The steel hooped cage crinoline. Those cages were mass produced in huge quantities, with factories across the Western world churning out tens of thousands a year. Alternative materials, such as whalebone, again, were used for hoops. This was followed by the bustle, corresponding to the advent of Beaux-Arts in architecture. Now, this Beaux-Arts movement was, in fact, a reaction to decades of bullshit. Virtue signaling wasn't invented yesterday, you know. In the entire history of humanity, there hasn't been a single oppressive regime that was not supported by virtue signaling in every stratum. High society or the gutter, there are voluntary agents of oppression everywhere. For years, the Parisians and the French people in general were told that austerity was a virtue, that luxury was shameful, that in a democratic society, everyone should be equal, that excess breeds poverty and ruins revolutionary spirit. Little by little, the elite began to put out feelers. Like, yes, austerity is good, very democratic and all, but can I wear my diamond necklace just this once? How about a new carriage? Can we redecorate this season? As for the working class, yes, all those wars and revolutions promise to raise one's living standards. So why are we still living in slums?
Now, you and I know that aesthetes are born in equal numbers, percentages in every stratum. So, this working class aesthete, who is tired of looking at ugliness all day long at work and then on his own street and inside his own slum apartment, takes pity on himself and his wife.
I mean, she's a woman, and one of the man's duties is to make his woman feel like a princess, at least once in a while. So he scrapes together some money. So maybe once a month, he and his wife put on their best clothes and walk over to the historic center, stroll around the park, take in a show, sit at a cafe, and hopefully admire good architecture. Not this austere shit, but really good architecture. Proponents of Beaux-Arts were happy to oblige. The elite gave them the green light, and the lower classes did not seem to object.
And then Louis Napoleon made himself emperor, hired Eugène Haussmann to do urban planning for him, and the great reconstruction of Paris took off.
Other countries paid close attention. Terms such as Baroque or Rococo, those were considered toxic, relics of unfortunate, oppressive, unfair past. But if you labeled it all Beaux-Arts and added a bit of clever engineering, you were safe. And so Beaux-Arts, which was Baroque on steroids, spread around the world to all continents except Antarctica. By the end of the century, this trend culminated in La Belle Époque, in the era known in France as La Belle Époque, and in the United States as the Gilded Age. The Gibson girl style emerged along the East Coast and then in the rest of the Republic as the personification of the feminine ideal of physical attractiveness, as portrayed by the pen and ink illustrations of Charles Dana Gibson. It corresponded to the
Art Nouveau
movement in architecture, all those, floral designs and ornaments and whatnot. Then there was the S-blend period and the pre-war practical period. By the mid-20th century, architecture across Europe and America shed ornament with near-religious zeal, a constructed environment hostile to beauty and to humans in general. The 1940s, the World War II decade, introduced leg exposure as a staple in women's fashion. To be sure, there had been earlier moments, of course, the 1920s come to mind, but by the 1940s, this was no longer an exception. And by the 1950s, leg exposure was firmly established, which to my way of thinking is a good thing. But then again, I'm an artist, so I'm kind of partial and kind of biased that way. After the war came the baby boom. Women had entered the workforce in large numbers, and there was this visible effort to steer them back towards domestic life. The fashion industry responded with this exaggerated form of femininity, highly stylized, carefully managed, and, I'd say sappy, cloying, not at all convincing. Then came the 1960s. The miniskirt and the mini dress appeared. That was a dramatic shift.
For all its odd proportions, this was arguably the last major eruption of overt femininity in everyday women's clothing.
But this was often paired with heavy boots, boxy tops, formless, and silhouettes that flattened rather than articulated the body. That decade embraced juvenilization, and fashion followed suit. And then the clincher came. The pantsuit became the norm. 200 years of feminism, 2 centuries of struggle, and suddenly the tone changed. The pantsuit marked a turning point. Equality pursued through sameness rather than distinction. You see, classical feminism championed equal rights, universal suffrage, equal opportunity in keeping with one's distinctive qualities. The goal was to make women equal as women, specifically to allow women to have their dignity as a natural God-given right, not to make them conduct themselves or dress like men. Universal suffrage is best represented by an equal number of pants and skirts at the polls. Pants and skirts, not pants and pants. Instead, from the 1960s on, women's fashions have been stubbornly chipping away at femininity, at female dignity. They have been dismal, boring, gender-effacing, disdainful of individuality. Architecture followed suit. As women's fashions started to become formless, so did new buildings. Brutalism at least pretended to pay homage to the 3 canons. New construction shed all pretenses. The idea was to excise the architectural element from architecture itself. The materials and technologies allowed this. New steel alloys, rather than the harmony of the design, provided the stability. They could keep the slab upright, freeing the designer from the inconvenient task of mastering proportion. Windows were no longer recessed into the facade. If there was a facade, more often than not, it was just a steel skeleton and tinted glass. Some architectural firms made efforts to build their reputation on the wow effect, designing buildings that made folks wonder why they didn't topple over. Fact: the wow effect wears off very quickly, while having to see it all the time does cause an anxiety. Not because you're afraid that it will fall down on you, but rather because your brain and your spirit keep suggesting that something is horribly wrong. Day after day, something is wrong here. Makes you uncomfortable. You suppress the feeling, but it's still there. You never get used to it. Other firms did not even bother pretending. One particular architect with more than 300 buildings in Manhattan claimed, half-jokingly, that he could design a residential high-rise while taking his morning ablutions. Formless, faceless slabs began to spring up all over cities. Gender-effacing clothes for women, soul-crushing architecture for everyone. That was the space-age decade. And instead of calling the entire thing what it was, a failed experiment, the onslaught continued. It continues as we speak. Entire historic neighborhoods are either damaged very seriously or demolished altogether to make room for this shit. See, if I were an existentialist, I'd probably say that life is a zero-sum game. We get our amenities like electricity, running water at home, cold and hot, the stove, the refrigerator, easy access to food and water, decent clothes for everyone, and on, But to compensate, the aesthetic aspect is taken away. That's the payment, and nothing can be done about it. But I am not an existentialist. I'm a Christian, and I believe that a lot can be done. We can petition and we can vote. All we need to do, really, is realize that architecture is, well, if you believe in God, it's part of your spiritual diet. If you don't, it's part of your psychological diet. Good architecture relieves stress, that much is obvious. And we don't even know how much of that stress is caused by having to look at fake architecture every day. Ren Faire costumes accomplish three things. They acknowledge sexual dimorphism, waist, hips, bust, posture. These clothes are unapologetically shaped. Whereas today's fashion often pretends that bodies are abstract, shape is optional, the attraction is politically awkward, Ren Faire costumes say, this is a human body. Look at it, you moron. Number two, these outfits are not casual, not utilitarian, not apologetic. They imply occasion, performance, and yes, status, even if it's playful. People respond to ceremony instinctively. Number three, they license confidence. Here's the key psychological move. At the Renaissance Fair, beauty is allowed. Display is expected. Knowing you look good is part of the game. And there is no moral penalty for being striking. Post-1815, ornament was assigned to women. Following World War II, we stripped ornament away entirely from women's fashion and from architecture. This is a school our children go to every day. And this is a building in which people live now. Happy? Renaissance fair culture proved something crucial. The appetite for ornament never went away. It was merely displaced into play, nostalgia, and costume. What today's culture says,
you can't dress like that and expect to be taken seriously.
And people respond,
fine, we'll just do it as fantasy then.
Which is exactly what Ren Fairs, cosplay, historical reenactment, and costume parties are. They are aesthetic pressure valves, which is why women at Ren Fairs stand straighter, move differently, make eye contact, and know they look good. Jill looks good and she knows it. The clothes are doing what clothes are supposed to do. Ironically, a term from the past comes to mind, liberation. It may be a bit late in the day, so many years after the sexual revolution, to talk about morality in clothing, wouldn't you say? I mean, society frowns on the unusual, and feminine clothes have become unusual. Humans dread ridicule. Jill is afraid to look feminine lest someone says derisively, Who does she think she is? Renaissance fair costumes succeed because they bypass today's absurd aesthetic guilt, reintroduce form, structure, and spectacle. When given permission to wear structured, ornamental, body aware clothing, women don't become ridiculous, they become radiant.
And they know it because the mirror, the posture, and the reactions all confirm it.
Which raises the uncomfortable follow up question: if this works so well in costume, why are we so afraid to let it work in real life? Well, the first thing we should do is amazingly simple. We should shorten the term costume party to just party. That's not nostalgia, that's social repair. And why not? Party, soiree. Yes, I know you can't cook or run or ride the subway in a bustle or a crinoline. Well, at least not comfortably, but you're not supposed to. Formal dress is for display. It signals pause. It marks time as special. Why not? Why not make classic silhouettes part of having a good time each time you go out? Some folks could and should look at it as a fantastic business opportunity because that's what it would be. Designers and tailors can and should come up with some radical solutions.
Smartass.
Modern materials allow collapsible structure, snap systems, modular understructures, restroom friendly engineering, and 30 seconds put on, put off, if desired. If desired, since it's every woman's sacred right to spend inordinate amounts of time in front of the mirror.
My sacred right, y'all?
Yes, women love to fuss with their clothes because it's ritual, preparation, and anticipation. All are highly important concepts and beautiful. Naturally, there are people out there, lots and lots of them, who will find this offensive because it runs contrary to their position, their worldview. Many teenagers are like that. Most grow out of it, but some manage to retain that adolescent type mentality in their 20s, 40s, and even in their 80s. They will tell you in all seriousness that you're wrong, that they love today's fashions. The canonical fashions are old and boring, and so forth. What do you say to that? I don't know. As a rule, it's impossible to argue with such people. They're impervious to logic, to evidence. They have their own truth, which is their worldview, and to them, their worldview is sacred and far more important than architecture, aesthetics, history, facts, or anything else. It's like they're perpetually taking a mental selfie. Me with architecture as a backdrop. Me with the scientific achievements of humanity in the background. Me and literature. Here's what I think about today's economy. They care very little about architecture, science, literature, or today's economy. They don't get goosebumps. It's all about me, 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 me. Gray hair, wrinkles, it doesn't matter. You're still facing a teenager. Well, yeah, of course, the Savior mentions metaphorically a certain type of beads and a certain type of mammals, but he never says we shouldn't love them. Quite the contrary. Overgrown teenagers are people, created like everyone else in God's image and after his likeness. And yes, they are the neighbor whom you should love. It's just that arguing with them about architecture or fashion is pointless in most cases. And so here's our friend Jill. Look how happy she is. Look how happy they all are. Liberation? Liberation from what? Think about it.